The silence in my parents' dining room didn't just fall, it crushed. It was the kind of heavy, airless vacuum that follows a gunshot. I remember the way the condensation on my water glass felt, slick and cold against my palm, as I watched the last ripples of laughter die in the throats of my relatives. My nephew, Evan, was leaning against the sideboard, his face a mottled, wine-stained red. He was 22, the golden child of the Bennett family, and currently, he was the only person in the room who seemed to be enjoying himself. He took a staggering step toward me, his eyes glassy but sharp with a cruel, youthful clarity. "I'm just saying what everyone thinks, Laura," he slurred, his voice cutting through the expensive atmosphere of my mother's welcome home dinner. "We all appreciate the gadgets, the tuition top-offs, the first-class upgrades for mom and dad. But let's be real. You're just the sad aunt who buys love. You've got nothing else, so you write checks to make us pretend you're part of the team. It's a transaction. We take the money, and you get to feel like you aren't alone for a weekend. Everyone wins, right?" He laughed then, a short, jagged sound, and looked around the table for backup. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I am a 42-year-old woman who has spent 2 decades navigating high-stakes corporate logistics. I know how to hold a poker face. But inside, I felt a strange, geological shift. I looked at my brother, Michael. He was cutting a piece of steak, his eyes fixed intensely on his plate, his jaw tight. He didn't tell his son to stop. He didn't defend the sister who had paid for his business's bridge loan 2 years ago. I looked at my parents. My mother was smoothing a wrinkle in the linen tablecloth with obsessive focus. My father was staring at the chandelier as if he'd never seen it before. The social humiliation wasn't the heat of Evan's words, it was the chilling temperature of the room's reaction. There was no outrage. There was no "Evan, that's enough." There was only the sound of a dozen people holding their breath because the drunkest person in the room had accidentally read the fine print of our family contract aloud. In that agonizing stretch of time, I realized that I wasn't a daughter, a sister, or an aunt to them. I was a service provider. And as I scanned their averted eyes, the quiet shock hit me harder than the insult. They didn't disagree with him. The room believed him. My name is Laura Bennett, and for 15 years, I have been the invisible scaffolding of the Bennett family. In my professional life, I manage global supply chains for a Fortune 500 company. I deal in precision, timing, and the movement of massive resources. I am used to being the person who makes things happen behind the scenes, the one who ensures that every moving part arrives exactly where it needs to be. I brought that same efficiency into my family, but I made the mistake of thinking I was building a legacy of care. In reality, I was just streamlining my own exploitation. I am the sad aunt because I am single, successful, and childless. In the narrow, suburban optics of my parents and Michael, a woman without a domestic anchor is a woman adrift. They couldn't reconcile my independence with their traditional milestones, so they categorized my generosity as a symptom of a void. When I paid for the family's summer cottage, it wasn't seen as a gift. It was viewed as me paying rent for a seat at the table. When I covered Michael's office renovation during his lean year, it wasn't a sibling's support. It was a desperate woman trying to stay relevant in a brother's busy life. I had become the family's private equity firm. I funded the Bennett Image, the elite sports camps for the grandkids, the anniversary cruises for my parents, the designer coats for Michael's wife, Sarah. I did it because I had the means and because I thought it was what a good family member did. I thought my financial generosity was a language of love, but they were translating it into the language of pity. They saw my checks as a white flag of surrender, an admission that I had failed at the traditional life and was now subsidizing theirs as a consolation prize. The psychological reduction was subtle until tonight. People have a cruel tendency to minimize kindness when they feel indebted to it. By labeling my generosity as buying love, they effectively absolve themselves of any actual gratitude. If I was the one buying, then they were doing me a favor by selling. It turned their entitlement into a charity act toward me. They weren't the ones asking for help. I was the one begging to be needed. As I stood in that dining room, watching Michael finally reach out to steady his drunken son, the pattern clicked into place with a sickening finality. This wasn't a one-time outburst from a kid who couldn't hold his bourbon. This was the script they had been reading from for a decade. Every thank you had been a lie, and every we love you, Laura had been a transaction fee. I had spent years providing the wine for people who were busy mocking the vintage. I realized then that I hadn't just been generous, I had been a willing participant in my own erasure. Michael is 3 years older than me, and in the Bennett hierarchy, those 3 years might as well be a century. He was the athlete, the one who married the homecoming queen, the one who stayed within 20 miles of our parents' house to build a life that looked exactly like theirs, only slightly more expensive. My brother is a man of calculated silences. He doesn't yell. He just allows things to happen around him that serve his interests. As Evan's slurred words hung in the air like a foul smell, Michael's silence was the loudest thing in the room. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull his son aside. He just took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine, the vintage I had shipped from France for this very occasion, and looked at me with a gaze that was terrifyingly empty. There is a specific power imbalance that occurs when one sibling becomes the provider while the other remains the favorite. I had always thought that by helping Michael through his business slumps or covering his children's extracurriculars, I was softening the edges of our rivalry. I thought I was showing him that my success was our success. But Michael didn't see it as a partnership. He saw it as a debt he couldn't repay, and in his mind, that debt had turned into a grievance. To Michael, my money was a constant reminder that the little sister had surpassed the big brother in the only way the world truly measures, the bottom line. By allowing Evan to speak, Michael was finally letting his proxy say the things he was too refined to voice himself. I watched him now, leaning back in his chair, his posture relaxed. He wasn't bothered by the cruelty. He was validated by it. For years, Michael had reinforced the sad aunt narrative through 1,000 tiny, subtle jabs. He'd make comments about how I must be so bored in my beautiful city apartment, or how he didn't know how I coped without the chaos of a family to come home to. He framed my life as a series of empty hours that I filled with work because I had no choice. It was a brilliant move. If he could convince the family, and me, that I was fundamentally broken, then my financial support wasn't a gift of strength, it was a desperate plea for connection. It turned my independence into a defect and has been simmering under the surface of our Sunday dinners for years. It was in the way he'd let the bill sit on the table until I reached for it, or the way he'd forget his wallet when we took the kids out. He felt entitled to my resources because he believed he was providing the one thing I couldn't buy, a sense of belonging. He truly thought he was doing me a favor by letting me pay for his life. As Evan began to laugh again, a wet, sloppy sound, Michael finally reached out, but only to pat the boy's hand. He didn't correct the narrative because he was the one who had written it. The insult wasn't a drunken accident. It was a coordinated release of the family's shared truth. It was the moment the mask slipped, revealing that my brother didn't just accept my sadness, he required it to feel superior. The mind has a cruel way of looping trauma, playing it back in high definition with the sensory details you didn't even know you were recording. As I sat at that table, the air in the dining room seemed to thicken with the scent of roasted rosemary and expensive bourbon, the very things I had provided. I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of my father's grandfather clock in the hallway, sounding like a gavel hitting a block over and over again. Guilty. Guilty of being pathetic. Guilty of buying a seat at a table where I was the punchline. I replayed the moment Evan's voice broke the peace, watching the faces around the room as if in slow motion. I looked at my cousin Marcus. He was a man I'd helped with a down payment 2 years ago when his credit was in the gutter. He didn't look at me. He ducked his head, hiding a smirk behind his napkin, his shoulders shaking with a suppressed, jagged vibration. He wasn't offended for me. He was entertained. Then there was Aunt Martha, my mother's sister, the one who always complimented my bravery for living alone in the city. She didn't gasp. She just exchanged a knowing, heavy-lidded look with my mother, a silent finally passing between them. The most devastating part wasn't the laughter, though, it was the pity. It was the way Sarah, Michael's wife, reached out as if to touch my arm, then pulled back, her eyes shining with a soft, condescending light that said, "Oh, honey, we all knew." The sensory data was overwhelming. I noticed the way the candlelight caught the gold rim of the china I had replaced for my mother's 65th birthday. I noticed the way Evan's hand trembled as he gripped his glass, the arrogance of youth buoyed by the unspoken consensus of the adults in the room. He wasn't a rogue agent. He was a mouthpiece. He was the only one drunk enough to lose his filter, but everyone else was sober enough to enjoy the show. I felt the heat of the room pressing against my skin, the clink of silverware sounding like ice breaking on a frozen lake. They were waiting for me to do something. They were waiting for the sad aunt to have a breakdown, to cry, to plead her case, or to offer even more money to smooth over the awkwardness. In past years, I would have bridged the gap. I would have made a joke at my own expense to put them at ease. I would have said, "Well, Evan certainly had a few, hasn't he?" and then I would have opened another bottle of wine to prove I was cool and unbothered. I would have tried to explain my worth through my actions, doubling down on my usefulness to prove I wasn't just a checkbook. I would have begged for their approval without saying a word. But as I looked at the grease glistening on Evan's chin and the cowardly silence of my brother, a cold, hard shutter closed over my heart. I realized that explaining myself was a form of submission. To explain is to acknowledge that their version of me has merit. To defend my life is to admit that it needs defending. I took a slow, steady breath, the scent of the room no longer feeling like home, but like a crime scene. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to cry. And I certainly wasn't going to explain that my sad life was full of art, travel, and peace that they couldn't even imagine. I decided, in that precise second, to let them keep their version of me. If they wanted a sad aunt who bought love, they could have her. But they were about to find out exactly what happens when the store closes for good. I didn't say a word. I just set my fork down with a quiet, metallic click that signaled the end of my participation. The most profound irony of the sad aunt label is that it was built on a foundation of complete ignorance. For 15 years, my family had consumed my resources while remaining entirely uninterested in the person producing them. They knew my title, they knew my salary bracket, and they knew my availability for holidays, but they knew nothing of my pulse. They never asked about the complexity of the logistics networks I managed, the high-stakes puzzles of global trade where a 3-hour delay in Singapore can cost millions. They never asked what it felt like to stand in a boardroom and hold the attention of people who actually respected my mind. To them, my career was just a generic office job that existed solely to fund their lifestyles. They assumed my solitude was a cage, a place of quiet desperation where I sat staring at the walls, waiting for a phone call. They couldn't conceive of a world where a woman actually enjoys the silence of a perfectly curated apartment. They didn't know about the Saturday mornings I spent in high-end galleries, or the way I felt when I landed in a foreign city where nobody knew my name. My solitude wasn't a failure to find a partner, it was a success in finding myself. I had built a life of total autonomy, where every piece of furniture, every book on the shelf, and every hour of the day belonged exclusively to me. I wasn't waiting for my life to begin. I was living a version of it that was too expansive for their narrow, suburban imaginations to grasp. I gave to them because I thought I had an abundance to share. My generosity wasn't a desperate attachment, it was supposed to be a lack of attachment to the material. I viewed money as a tool to make life easier for the people I loved, assuming they saw the heart behind the hand. I gave without strings because I didn't think I needed strings to keep my family close. I thought the blood bond was enough. I thought that by removing the financial friction from Michael's life or my parents' retirement, I was creating space for us to simply be together as people. I was removing the obstacles so we could find the affection. But as I sat there, the sadness they projected onto me felt like a heavy, dusty cloak I was finally ready to shed. I looked at my hands, steady on the table, and realized that I had never been the lonely one. They were the ones trapped in a cycle of dependency and quiet resentment. Michael was lonely in a marriage he couldn't afford without my help. My parents were lonely in a status-obsessed social circle that they maintained with my dividends. Evan was lonely in his own arrogance, already leaning on the very person who was empty to despise. I was the only one in the room who was truly full. I had a life that existed entirely outside of their approval, a world of professional triumph and personal peace that they had never bothered to visit. The realization hit me with a quiet, grounding force. I wasn't independent because I was alone. I was alone because I was independent. My strength had been reimagined as a weakness so they could feel better about their own fragility. I looked at the table of people who thought they knew me, and for the first time, I felt a wave of genuine relief. If they couldn't see the woman I actually was, they no longer deserved the version of me they had been using. I wasn't sad. I was finally, irrevocably, free. The apology didn't come that night. It didn't even come the next morning. It arrived 3 days later, in the form of a tentative, hovering presence in the lobby of my office building. I was coming down for a mid-morning coffee, my mind occupied with a shipping bottleneck in Rotterdam, when I saw him. Evan looked smaller without the liquid courage of bourbon. He was hunched over his phone, wearing a hoodie that looked like it hadn't been washed in a few days. The golden child looked tarnished. When he saw me, he jumped, his face flushing with a pale, sickly version of the red I'd seen at dinner. "Aunt Laura," he started, his voice cracking. "Can we talk? Just for a second?" I didn't smile, and I didn't scold him. I simply walked toward a quiet corner of the lobby and waited. I stood with my hands in the pockets of my tailored coat, watching him fidget. It was a study in discomfort. He started with the standard script. He'd had too much to drink, he didn't remember everything, he was going through a lot with his senior year finals. It was a clumsy, self-protective performance designed to minimize his agency. He wasn't apologizing for the thought. He was apologizing for the timing and the volume. I didn't mean it like that, he stammered, looking at everything in the lobby except my eyes. I was frustrated. I know you do a lot for us. Dad told me I really messed up. He said you might not help with the grad school applications or the apartment deposit now. I'm really sorry if I hurt your feelings. You're not actually sad, I was just being an idiot. There it was. The pivot. The apology wasn't about my wounded dignity. It was about the looming threat to his financial future. He was checking to see if the ATM was still broken or if a few sorries could reboot the system. In the past, I would have rushed to comfort him. I would have said, "Oh, Evan, don't worry about it, we all make mistakes," and I would have hugged him to make the awkwardness go away. I would have prioritized his comfort over my own self-respect because that's what good aunts do. But as I listened to him, I felt a strange, cold detachment. I wasn't angry. I was simply finished. I watched him scramble for more words, his eyes darting to my face for a sign of softening. I gave him nothing. No nod, no reassuring smile, no forgiveness. "I hear you, Evan," I said finally. My voice was level, professional, and entirely devoid of heat. "You said what you said. I'm not interested in excuses about the bourbon. I'm interested in the fact that you feel my presence in your life is a transaction. You've given me a lot to think about regarding how I spend my time and my money." His face fell. He realized I wasn't playing the role. The sad aunt was supposed to be grateful for the apology, desperate to return to the status quo. By remaining calm and distant, I had shifted the power. He left the building looking more shaken than I had ever seen him, and as I watched him walk away, I realized that my silence was the most devastating response I could give. I wasn't his safety net anymore. I was a stranger who held all the cards. The following week, the Bennett family machinery shifted into high gear. It was a subtle, coordinated effort to pretend the foundation hadn't cracked. My mother called 3 times a day, her voice a forced, cheerful lilt as she talked about the weather, the neighbors, or a new recipe she'd tried. She was testing the waters, waiting for me to bring it up so she could tell me I was overreacting. When I didn't take the bait, the frustration began to leak through. "Laura, darling," she finally said on Thursday, "we're all just so tense. Michael says you haven't returned his texts about the beach house rental. Don't you think it's time we put this little unpleasantness behind us? Evan is just a boy. You know how dramatics run in this family." It was a classic Bennett move, minimize the assault until it becomes a little unpleasantness. They were trying to gaslight me into believing that my sense of self-respect was actually a lack of a sense of humor. Michael tried a different tactic. He sent a group email with the subject line "Summer Plans," detailing the costs for the family's upcoming trip to the Hamptons. He attached a spreadsheet, his own clumsy version of my professional work, and added a note at the bottom. "Laura, let us know when you've wired the deposit. We need to lock this in by Friday." There was no mention of the dinner. No "Are you okay?" It was an aggressive assumption of my continued compliance. I stayed neutral. When I did respond, my emails were 1 sentence long, devoid of emotion or subtext. "I am reviewing my personal finances and will let you know," I wrote. The discomfort on their end was palpable. They weren't used to a Laura who didn't apologize for her own silence. They were used to a woman who smoothed over every rough edge with a check or a self-deprecating laugh. By refusing to engage in the drama, I was forcing them to sit in the vacuum Evan had created. The sad aunt was supposed to be the one feeling uncomfortable, but by simply holding my ground, I had transferred that weight back to them. I watched their frantic attempts to return to normal from a distance. Sarah, Michael's wife, sent me a gift basket of expensive chocolates with a card that read, "Thinking of you. Families are messy, right?" I left the basket in the break room at my office without opening it. I wasn't interested in their peace offerings because they weren't offers of peace. They were bribes for my return to the role of the benefactor. They didn't want me back. They wanted my resources back, and they wanted the guilt of their own silence at that dinner to vanish. I began to withdraw, not with a bang, but with a quiet, systematic precision. I cancelled the recurring transfers for the kids' tutoring. I stepped down from the board of the family's favorite charity. I stopped answering the group chat. I didn't block them. I simply became a ghost in my own life script. Each time I hit delete on a request or ignored a manipulative voicemail, I felt lighter. They had spent years assuming that I needed them to feel whole. They were about to learn that when the sad aunt stops buying the love, the only thing left in the room is the cold, empty space where their own gratitude should have been. The Bennetts didn't notice the shift because they were too busy waiting for my inevitable surrender. They were so convinced of my desperation, so certain that I couldn't survive without the warmth of their reflected light, that they mistook my silence for a tantrum. In their minds, I was just pouting in my expensive apartment, waiting for them to invite me back so I could pay for the privilege of their company. Because they had never valued my presence, they didn't realize that my absence had already begun. They were like people standing on a bridge, mocking the water below, never noticing that the pilings were being removed one by one. I stopped the rescues first. Usually, when Michael's business partner botched a contract or his property tax bill came in higher than expected, I would get a frantic, venting phone call. It was never a direct ask. It was a performance of stress designed to trigger my savior reflex. This time, when the call came, I listened. I heard the familiar pitch of panic in Michael's voice as he described a cash flow gap. In the past, I would have said, "Don't worry, I'll wire you a bridge loan." This time, I just said, "That sounds incredibly stressful, Michael. I'm sure you'll figure it out. Anyway, I have a meeting." The silence on the other end was a vacuum of pure confusion. I stopped the overshowing next. I was the person who always brought the 3 extra sides to Thanksgiving, the one who sent flowers for every minor milestone, the one who curated personalized gift boxes for every niece and nephew just because it was Tuesday. I stopped. I didn't send a thinking of you card when Sarah's sister had surgery. I didn't overnight a replacement laptop when Evan mentioned his was glitching. I did exactly what they expected a sad, lonely woman to do. I stayed in my own world. The irony was that they had spent years calling me overbearing and trying too hard. But the moment I stopped trying, the luxury of their lives began to fray at the edges. They didn't notice at first because entitlement is a powerful anesthetic. They assumed the laptop was just late. They assumed Michael's bridge loan would come from elsewhere or that I was just being difficult for a few days. They were so focused on their own narratives that they couldn't see the structural integrity of their lifestyle was tied directly to my bank account. They had mistaken my generosity for a personality trait, something I did because I had to, like breathing. They never considered that it was a choice, and that a choice can be retracted. The subtle consequences began to leak through the cracks of our family facade by the end of the month. It started with a snide comment from Sarah about how she had to actually grocery shop for the family brunch because I hadn't sent the usual high-end catering platter. Then came the realization that the family fund I usually topped off for my parents' country club dues was sitting at zero. There was no explosion yet, just a series of small, inconvenient thuds as their expectations hit the reality of my new boundaries. I watched it all from the safety of my office, a world where things actually made sense. I wasn't the sad one anymore. I was the one holding the ledger, watching the people who called me pathetic slowly realize that their entire world was built on a foundation they had just finished insulting. The shift in Michael's tone was the first real indicator that the anesthesia of entitlement was wearing off. It happened on a Tuesday evening. Usually, a Tuesday call from Michael meant he wanted to complain about his golf handicap or subtly mention a great investment opportunity that required $50,000 of my liquid capital. But this time, his voice had lost its breezy, authoritative edge. It was thin and reedy. "Laura," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "The payment for Evan's final semester housing was due yesterday. I checked the portal, and it's still outstanding. I assume there was just a glitch with your bank." He phrased it as a technical error because his ego couldn't yet process a world where I simply said no. To Michael, my money was like the weather. Sometimes there was a storm, but the atmosphere itself was permanent. I sat at my desk, looking out at the city skyline, the lights of Manhattan twinkling like cold diamonds. I didn't rush to reassure him. I didn't apologize for the glitch. I let the silence stretch until I could hear his rhythmic, agitated breathing on the other end of the line. "There's no glitch, Michael," I said evenly. "I just didn't pay it." The silence that followed was different from the one in my parents' dining room. That silence had been smug. This one was terrified. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head as he tried to figure out which version of the sad aunt he was talking to. "What do you mean you didn't pay it?" Laura, he'll be evicted. You can't do this over a drunken comment. We're talking about his education, his future. Are you really that petty? There it was, the word petty. It was the sibling of sad. If they couldn't shame me into being a benefactor, they would try to shame me into being a villain. I'm not being anything, Michael, I replied. I picked up a pen and began doodling neat, geometric squares on a notepad. I am simply living my life as the person Evan described. A woman with no one and nothing, remember? A person whose love is bought. I've decided to stop the transaction. If Evan's education is at risk, I suggest you look into your own savings. Or perhaps he can take out a loan, like the millions of other students who don't have a sad aunt to bankroll their existence. My voice was devoid of malice. It was the voice I used to negotiate shipping rates with vendors who tried to overcharge me. It was purely business. He began to sputter, his tone shifting from demand to a frantic, ugly sort of bargaining. He started listing all the things they did for me. The invitations to Sunday dinner, the fact that they let me be part of the kids' lives, their effort it took to include me. He was accidentally confirming every word Evan had said. He was admitting that my inclusion was a chore they performed in exchange for my wealth. He didn't realize he was hand-delivering the final proof I needed to walk away. I'm not discussing this further, I said, cutting him off mid-sentence. I have plans for dinner. Goodbye, Michael. I hung up before he could respond. I didn't block him, but I did turn my phone off. For the first time in years, the only person I had to account for was the woman staring back at me in the window's reflection. And she looked more than okay. The explosion I expected, the screaming matches, the dramatic interventions, the formal family meetings, never actually happened. Instead, something far more unsettling for them took place, a quiet, desperate recalibration. Once it became clear that the bank was closed and the sad aunt was no longer seeking approval, the atmosphere shifted from condescension to a frantic, awkward sort of respect. The invitations changed. It was the kind of respect people were having to a predator they previously thought was a pet, and started they realized that my presence wasn't a desperate plea for inclusion. It was the only thing power had shifted so and financial that they were now the ones performing for me. At my niece's birthday party, which I attended without bringing the usual mountain of expensive gifts, the air was thick with a new kind of tension. My parents didn't lecture me on my responsibilities. Instead, they watched me from across the room with a mixture of awe and genuine fear. They didn't know how to interact with a version of me that didn't need anything from them. I stood in the center of their living room, a glass of wine in my hand, feeling entirely unbothered. I watched Michael try to make small talk, his eyes darting to my face to see if I was still angry. He found no anger there, which seemed to terrify him more than a shouting match would have. Anger is a connection. It's a form of investment. Silence is a severance. By being pleasant but distant, I was showing him that he no longer had the power to even hurt me. The pity that used to color their voices had been replaced by a careful, measured politeness. They were walking on eggshells, not because they cared about my feelings, but because they finally understood that I was the one with the floorboards. Evan was there too, sitting in a corner, avoiding my gaze. He looked humbled, or perhaps just sobered by the reality of his new student loan balance. He didn't make any more jokes. He didn't seek the spotlight. The truth bomb he had dropped had ended up blowing up his own world, not mine. I realized as I watched them all that I had spent years waiting for them to validate my worth. I had waited for them to say, "Laura, you're important to us for more than what you provide." But as I stood there in the quiet, I realized I didn't need them to say it. Their sudden, fawning respect was the only confession of my value I was ever going to get, and it was enough. I chose peace over their validation. I wasn't waiting for an apology anymore. I was just waiting for my Uber to take me back to the life I had built for myself. There was no grand finale. There was no cinematic moment where I stood at the head of the table and delivered a scathing monologue that left them all in tears. In the world of high-stakes logistics, the most powerful move isn't a loud confrontation. It is the quiet withdrawal of labor. I simply stopped being the engine that drove the Bennett family machine. I reclaimed my identity by refusing to be the character they had written for me. I am not the sad aunt. I am not the provider. I am Laura Bennett, a woman who built her own sanctuary out of ambition, resilience, and a silence that no longer feels like a void. I didn't offer a dramatic forgiveness scene, nor did I seek a hollow revenge. Forgiveness, in its truest form, often looks like indifference. I don't hate them. I don't even pity them anymore. Hate and pity are both anchors, and I am finally out at sea, catching a wind they can't reach. Michael still calls occasionally, his voice practiced and careful, but the calls go to voicemail more often than not. My parents still send the group texts, but they are no longer the center of my emotional universe. I attend the family functions when it suits me, I bring a polite bottle of wine, and I leave when I am tired. The power didn't come from changing them, it came from realizing that their opinion of me was never my responsibility to correct. I look at Evan now and I see a young man who learned a very expensive lesson about the weight of words. He isn't the victim of my pettiness, and I am not the villain of his story. We are simply two people whose lives no longer intersect at the point of a checkbook. My life is full, not because I have a traditional family or a husband or a seat at a table that doesn't respect me, but because I have stopped trying to buy a version of love that was never for sale. I have my work, my travels, and the profound, echoing peace of a home where the only truth spoken is my own. I used to think that being essential meant being used. I was wrong. Being essential means knowing your own value so deeply that you no longer need to see it reflected in the eyes of people who are too small to appreciate the view. I am not the sad aunt who buys love, I am the woman who finally realized she was the most valuable thing in the room, and she decided to keep herself all for herself. The store is closed, the ledgers are balanced, and for the first time in my life, the silence is exactly what I wanted it to be. Love isn't a transaction, and I am finally rich enough to know the difference. Thank you for listening to my story. It's a quiet kind of victory, but it's mine. I'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching this from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments.